why is it harder for women to lose fat than men?
Okay, so, oh wait, sorry. Before we get to that, I want to go back and touch on the birth control and body weight thing. I nearly forgot.
Oh, yeah.
That is the question that probably comes up literally the most often. Does birth control cause weight gain? And the answer is kind of, but it's complicated. So it seems like a lot of that belief seems to come out of the 70s, where the stuff was super harsh, super high dose. Estrogen, the synthetic estrogen does cause water retention. Now, when you look at the studies in the aggregate, the average weight gain for most forms of birth control is like 1 to 2 pounds, if that. The average, and I'm using that term very specifically. Depo-Provera is the exception. It's up at like 7 pounds on average. Like, it is significantly, significantly different. And I've heard of women that like 9 months later, when they go off it, they can't lose a pound. Like, it messes up their system for a long time because it takes so long to clear them. But then when you start looking at the research, you see the huge variance. So I've got a couple papers I think where I reported on in the book, and they looked at like 3 different forms of hormonal birth control, and then like the copper IUD, which in premise shouldn't be doing this. And they found that average weight gain was like 0, a couple pounds, but then the range was enormous. Like, in one of them, I want to say like one woman lost like 16, it was like 30 pounds over a year. And I think in one study, a woman either gained, it was either 30 or 60 pounds in a year, right? But let's say you take 20 women, and here's their weight gain of 10, and here's their weight loss of 10, and you average it, you end up with a 0.
Right.
But it's not indicating any individual woman's. The thing is, the copper IUD had the exact same range, suggesting that it is more of a lifestyle issue than anything else, or an aging issue, and that as frequently as not, birth control may be getting blamed. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that it can't have an effect. Some physicians, I guess, think like 25% of women may be prone to it. High synthetic progestins can increase appetite because it is like the second half of the cycle, right? When I looked at the data in athletes, invariably what you see is that the monophasic oral birth control, the one with low levels all the way through, very small effect, if any. And if it's a pound or two, it's water, it comes right off. But the triphasic, where the progestin gets bumped really high in week 3, several pounds of fat gain, several pounds of muscle loss over several months.
Oh, wow.
Which really just points to what we talked about early on. Like, I hate to say that there's a bad, hormones are neither good nor bad, you know that, but if there is a bad hormone in a body composition sense, oh, it's progesterone. And I don't understand either. There's another author in the field who suggested a progesterone only birth control. I have no idea why. Somebody asked me to explain. I go ask them, because it doesn't make any sense to me either. That said, they've done a couple studies in athletes who are presumably controlling their activity and food intake. And weight gain over a year is essentially nil, which really does kind of, now it's entirely possible, like I said, that the birth control may be affecting things like appetite. Depo-Provera, depending on when you give it to a woman in her cycle, can actually increase metabolic rate by about 5%, but it increases appetite because of what it does in the brain, because it's high dose. It's a high dose form of progesterone. I've talked to many like physique coaches who train, bikini, female fitness, physique. They don't seem to really see a significant impact there, where birth control either causes fat gain or it prevents them from reaching contest. Excuse me. Again, it's not like any given woman might not experience this, but it seems like in the aggregate, not the huge effect that it's probably is attributed to it. Okay, so women and fat loss. Why do women lose fat slower than men? Well, the first question to actually ask is, do they?
Right.
And the answer is yes and no, depending on how you want to look at it. On average, women are smaller than men, way less than men. And before anyone gets, I said on average, yes, of course, you can find women that are taller than men, on average. They typically have a higher body fat percentage. than men by about 8 to 10%, less muscle mass on average. So a lot of times when they look at when you see the weight loss reported from a given study, it says it says a percentage. Well, if you put a man and a woman on the same dietary intervention, and he loses 5 pounds and she loses 3, well, sorry, let me rephrase that. The absolute number may be different because she's smaller, but the percentage is about the same. Not always, but it's close. So there's that. Men, just by dint of being bigger on the same intervention, of course, they will lose at a greater absolute rate. That actually brings up even a separate issue that I'll come back to. Like, let's talk about exercise. When you look at exercise studies, again, women typically do lose less than men. Now, there's a famous study. I've seen it yet. It's funny. Everybody misrepresents the study or misreports it somehow in different domains. So they took men and women and they trained them for a half marathon over like 6 months. And they use these like increasing running volumes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this study gets cited as men lost weight and women didn't. Over 6 months, the men lost 2 pounds. The women lost 1. Just turned out that the women's value wasn't statistically significant. To which I say, it's 2 versus 1. Really, this is what you're going to pin this argument on? But here's the thing. When you look at the body composition changes, the men and women lost nearly identical amounts of fat, but the women gained like a pound of muscle, and that's what offset the difference.
Okay.
Even that said, there's another group of researchers that address this very systematically. And they said, okay, most exercise studies take folks and go, all right, we're going to make you do 30 minutes of activity at whatever, 70% of maximum heart rate, whatever it is. You take women and men and do that, and the women always lose less weight. Well, being smaller, having lower power outputs, lower running speeds, 30 minutes of exercise for a woman will burn less calories than for a man. Of course they lose less weight. The deficit's small. That group said, all right, what if we equate the amount of calories burned? We're going to make both groups burn. And they progressed. It's actually a really well done study. They started them at like 100 calories 6 days a week. They built them up over 6 months. They're burning like 600. Like, it's a really good progression. I wish more beginners would follow it. And what they found was that fat loss was basically identical because they were burning the same number of calories. But then this points out another issue. The women had to do like 25% more total activity. To create the same deficit, women from exercise, women have to do proportionally more or work at a higher intensity, but that's a separate thing. If both do 30 minutes, so that's another factor that needs to be taken. But even that points to another issue. Let's say you have a male, big male, 2,700 calorie maintenance, and a smaller woman, 1,700 calorie maintenance. You want to lose a pound, so you take 500 calories a day out of their diet. The guy's still got plenty of food to eat, and that woman will be suffering.
Right.
It is frequently much more difficult, if not impossible, to generate the same deficit in a woman as in a man by dint of the difference in body size and calorie expenditure. Right? In the physique world, they talk about being on poverty calories, because smaller women, right? If you're a 120-pound woman physique athlete trying to get, you don't have a lot of food unless you're doing a lot of activity. Whereas a larger male at 180, he's still got plenty to eat, where he won't feel like, he'll actually, so you've got that factor, but there's another variable. Well, there's several more. Somewhat confusingly, during aerobic activity, during up to like low and moderate intensity aerobic activity, women burn a higher percentage of fat than men. And it's actually due to estrogen. If you slap an estrogen patch on a guy, he burns just as much fat as the woman does. That's an estrogen effect, no doubt about it. You also see that women, the proportion of weight that they lose a higher proportion of fat than men and very little muscle. Some of which is probably related to differences in body fat percentage, but that neither here nor there. It is what it is. Well, to lose a pound of fat requires 3,500 calorie deficit, close enough. To lose a pound of muscle about 600 calories. In fact, if you want to lose weight as rapidly as possible, try to lose as much muscle as you can. If you want to see the scale drop. I am convinced that all those rapid weight loss centers that say don't exercise, I'm convinced that that's the reasoning for it.
Like
Sparing muscle loss slows weight loss.
Yeah.
I could be wrong, but that's what my gut says. So men, because they're losing a higher proportion of muscle, men and women are on the same deficit. He will lose weight faster. She will lose fat, but that also takes proportionally longer, right? So on a 500 calorie deficit, it will take her 7 days to lose that pound of fat because she's losing almost pure fat. He will lose the pound faster, but the fat may actually take a little bit longer than that. But this then feeds into, can we even create the same deficit in a smaller woman? The answer is probably not.
Yeah.
Realistic. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that reminds me too of when you compare an obese person to a normal weight person, both trying to lose weight. Obviously, the person with more mass who's obese, regardless of their gender, is going to lose weight faster.
Exactly. But that's a great comparison. We're just seeing this as a systematically average difference in women and men overall. However, there is also a biology, like those are all sort of the practical things that feed into this, but there's also a biology to it. Actually, one of the first papers I read, this was like over a decade ago, when I realized that I did not want to get into women's issues because I knew it was going to be way too, like I deliberately avoided it for a decade plus because I just knew it was going to be tough.
Blame you.
And it was a researcher. They must be married. It was Hoyenga and Hoyenga. They got to be a husband and wife team, and they wrote this paper that mostly animal work with a little. At the time, there wasn't a lot of human research on sort of arguing in an evolutionary sense why the female biology was more resistant to fat loss, because it is in other ways. And their sort of basic premise was that, and this is absolutely true, essentially women are responsible for the survival of the human race. Like, this sounds like me pandering, but it's really true, right? Once men have done what little they need to do to create a child, in a very real way, they can leave, in the sense from what's required. I don't want people to mishear that. In a purely biological sense, she is now tasked with bringing the child to term, ensuring that it survives, usually about age 5, right? Don't name him before age 5. And if you're on a farm, don't name him if you're going to eat him. Whole separate thing. Whereas, so in that sense, her body is basically, it's far more important that she's able to survive. And you do see this in certain extreme conditions. Women are much more likely to survive famines. They're much more likely to survive in concentration camps than men, who die more easily. So if you think about this in sort of an evolutionary sense, let's say you've got a village or whatever, or there's a situation where there's limited food, right? Male impregnates a woman. She now has the massive calorie cost of taking that child to term. Now, first and foremost, and this is super fascinating to me, is even in the case where a woman may be almost starving to death, right? Her body will kind of work it out, right? A woman's ability to almost just like tear her own body down to ensure that the child has the best chance of just even being brought to term is massive, because that's what her body essentially, sorry, I'm going to stop that sentence right there because it's going to get misheard. Much of the biology of women is aimed at that. I was about to say something like that's what she basically evolved to do, and that as a whole, that sounds like, women are for making babies, and that's not what I'm saying. That's what the biology has sort of adapted to do. But if you think about it, if you're in a situation where there's very little food resources, once a male has done his job, it's better if he dies, because that leaves more food for her and the kid. Like, there's actually a very logical reason for that. And when you start looking at some of the biology of this, in terms of what happens hormonally in response to dieting and exercise, in terms of women's ability to sort of save energy. And how did I see it phrased one time? Women's bodies are excellent at conserving calories and fat stores. which sucks, but that's the way it is, right? Because as I mentioned, women's hip and thigh fat is specifically there to support pregnancy and breastfeeding. Way back when I was looking at the stubborn fat thing, right? Like women's hip and thigh fat is the hardest to lose under most conditions. During breastfeeding, it's the exact opposite. Women's hip and thigh fat is the easiest to mobilize. And I spent many months trying to figure out, is there some way I can mimic the hormonal situation of breastfeeding in female dieters to get them to, I never came up with anything. I should probably go back and revisit that project. It was just one of my wild flights of fancy. But this all makes a certain sort of logical sense. But under those high stress conditions, where there may be insufficient calories, and I want to talk about something called energy availability that comes right out of this. Her body has a woman's body has a much stronger response to it in terms of reducing energy expenditure, both harder and faster than a man's. So there are all the practical issues I mentioned in terms of creating a deficit, amount of exercise, et cetera, but there is absolutely a biology behind it that exists to make sure women can survive. I don't want to get too deep into all the hormonal stuff. Oh, actually, so here's one that's interesting. Have y'all talked much about leptin on your podcast?
No, not at all.
Okay. Short version of a very long story. Leptin is a signal predominantly made in fat cells that tells the brain how much you're eating and how much body fat you have, right? For years, they look for this signal. How does the body know when it's starving to death? That's the primary one. When leptin drops, your brain goes, uh-oh, we don't have enough calories. We should probably adapt stuff down the road. All right. So, and it decreases in response to a calorie deficit very, very quickly, and the response to fat loss. So they did a study, and they took women and men, and they had them do a fixed amount of exercise, but then they replaced the food intake. They replaced the energy expenditure from activity so they kept them at calorie balance. And at the end of the week, the men, leptin levels hadn't changed. And in the women, despite being at calorie balance in response to exercise, their leptin levels had dropped.
Wow.
So there is a fundamental difference in the biology there. Women actually produce more leptin than men due to estrogen, the way their fat cells produce it. But I suspect they respond to a greater degree to the drops than men. So their systems do and I already mentioned another one of those adaptations, which is that a woman's body will go through the seemingly wasteful process of building an endometrium after ovulation to simply break, and it's because it saves about 1,400 calories a month. And over a woman's lifespan, that's a staggering number of calories. So a woman's body is sort of very much geared towards that in response to dieting. And as a really good example of this, all right, so something many women undergo is menstrual cycle dysfunction in response to dieting and exercise, right? Where they can, well, usually in the olden days, they talked about it having, eumenorrhea, which is having a normal menstrual cycle, and amenorrhea, the lack of a menstrual cycle. Turns out there's a couple steps in between these subclinical menstrual cycle disorders that occur, not really relevant here. And for years, they wondered what causes this. Because when women started to enter sport in the 80s, they started to see this, usually in runners, gymnasts, sports that had an emphasis on thinness, weight class sports, where there was sort of a primacy on keeping body weight low. And so, the savants of the day, which were kind of guessing at it, they were like, well, low body fat was the first idea. And this made logical sense, right? We knew that children typically don't hit puberty till their body fat percentage gets above a certain level. So it made a certain logical sense. Well, if body fat gets too low, the body somehow knows and will shut down menstrual cycle dysfunction. Turns out not to be that exactly, because research then found that, you can find women at 15% body fat that are still menstruating and women at 22 that aren't. So it didn't seem like there was this hard cutoff. Maybe it was the stress of activity, because these athletes were doing a tremendous amount of exercise. Maybe it was their low food intake. They were frequently seeing eating disorders, insufficient calorie intake. The problem is, or maybe it's all of them, right? Who the hell knows? If you've got an athlete who's super light, super lean, under eating, and training 40 hours a week, how do you figure out what it is? Now, just because I think this is funny, one of my little tricks. one of the, I think, the best theories behind why this occurred, right? So when women's prolactin levels go up, that inhibits ovulation. And one of the things that raises prolactin is nipple stimulation, like from breastfeeding. One of the theories that was thrown out was that, like in runners and female athletes that were having a lot of up and down motion, that nipple stimulation from their bra was causing prolactin to go up and inhibit ovulation. Just one of those little random trivia bits that I picked up along the way. So jump forward, and there's a researcher named Ann Lukes who decided to just sit down and figure this out. And there's a concept called energy availability. I know this is not calorie balance. This is not calories in versus calories out. This is calorie intake minus exercise calorie expenditure. And the best way to think of this, this is the calories that are left over to run everything else in the body, right? Like, you know, your hearts are doing heart things and your lungs are doing, and all the things that require calories. Energy availability is what's left over. And it had been theorized for a while that, okay, if you have a limited energy availability, the body will have to make choices about what to keep going, right? Because relative different parts of us are relatively more or less important from a survival standpoint. So she took that idea and created some very, what are usually referred to as elegant studies. They're very well designed. So she took women, it was 5 days, and she had them either do a ton of exercise while keeping food intake the same, or do no exercise and drop calorie intake. So she was trying to separate out the activity and the food intake to create this super low energy availability. And what she found was, regardless of how that low energy availability was created, a woman's system cratered. T3, thyroid levels started to go down. The big change she saw was something called luteinizing hormone that's part of the control of the whole menstrual cycle, the hormonal system. It changed in how it was functioning. And did they see menstrual cycle dysfunction 5 days? Of course not. But down the road, this would be predicted. Okay, so our first study was, all right, boom, it's energy availability. The body fat level of the women didn't seem to make any difference whatsoever. So then she did her next set of studies. She's done a ton of these things where she's like, okay, let's do different energy availabilities, right? So she set it up same way, different levels of activity to test like 50K, and it's set in kilocalories per kilogram of lean body mass, right? All that matters is that your fat doesn't need enough calories to matter. It's only what the muscle tissue needs or lean body mass needs, being muscle, organs, etc. So she's like, all right, 50, 40, 30, 20, 10, and found that 30 was kind of this critical threshold. Above that, there was no problem. And that's something, let's see, it's like 13.6 calories per pound of lean body mass. It's somewhere in that range. And then below 30, everything went bad. All right, boom. And in the late 2000s, when this idea came out, everyone was like, do not ever cross this threshold. The problem is, for people trying to get very lean, you have to, eventually. It's a matter of when and for how long.
Right.
And if you look back at some of the earlier studies and sort of parse them in this regard, you start to see that, okay, this was explaining it. One of the things I talk about them in the book, they took like girls at camp or something, and they put them into like, all right, y'all are gonna start running 10 miles today. Just massive. And they found that most of them experienced menstrual cycle dysfunction. They're like, it's the stress of exercise. The problem was they also lost weight. And even so so Lukes was trying to sort of, like I said, separate these things out. She did. Now I bring this up in the sense that that indicates where things, and in women, if you take a woman who just cuts her calories and raises her activity within 5 to 7 days, she can lower her active thyroid hormone levels, which will start to reduce basal metabolic rate, which will start to cause essentially starvation response. In not like metabolic damage, not that stuff, just in a biological sense. Her body will sort of start conserving calories because it'll go, whoa, suddenly we got this low energy available. It can happen that quickly. And we've all had clients that did it. Yeah. Now there's less research on men, but you do occasionally see similar things. Like the male equivalent of a woman losing her menstrual cycle is like functional hypogonadism, testosterone levels are down, like way low. And you see this in male runners, jockeys, the freak shows where they, you got guys who are 5'7" who weigh like 110 pounds, like insane sport. And they do all the same unhealthy stuff that a lot of female athletes do. And then they've started to look at this in men. So women, 30 kilocalories per kg is the nominal cutoff. And I'll touch on that again. For men, you can go to 15 before you see a problem. Men's bodies can simply are more robust in the sense that their bodies just don't respond to it in the same way that a woman's will. Which is why men can diet harder, train more, and get away with it. Whereas a woman doing that may actually end up causing more harm than good. And we've all seen that with women who you almost have to sort of coax it. And it's like we talked about, you have to work with the system, since you can't change it or correct it or fix it. I mean, you could if we had injectable leptin, but that doesn't exist in a practical sense right now for that type of stuff. So there's sort of a good example is that man and woman at 25, energy availability of 25, the woman will start to see metabolic adaptations to that. The man's body will not.
So going off of that metabolic adaptation, and since it can be different even within women by like such a large extent. If you have a female client that maybe let's say she's been dieting or like on, very low calories for many years and over exercising, doing lots of cardio, and she comes to you and she's like, I feel like I'm gaining weight, or I feel like I'm stuck and anything I eat sticks to me. What do I do to lose weight? What kind of things would you do to take her through to become more healthy and also to get to that goal eventually?
Yeah, I'm honestly, I stick to the physiology end of things. Then I'm not good with behavior change stuff, but in the most general sense, yeah, this is one of those places. And so in my 20s, I knew at some fundamental level that too much exercise and too little food caused more harm. And then I had female clients that did it. I had this one, she claimed to be eating 200 calories a day, doing 2 hours in a row. She told me, she's like, for breakfast, I have half an egg. How do you have half an egg? Never did figure it out. And for weeks, I'm like, you got to eat more and exercise less. Well, how can that work? I go, you're losing zero. It can't work any worse. And then she went out of town and went on a cruise or something and came back a week later. And she's like, I'm 5 pounds down. I'm like, what did I tell you? And she went right back to dieting and exercising like a crazy person. So yeah, this is one of those cases where you may have to do, I'm not a big fan of the concept of reverse dieting in general, but in this situation, if you crank a ton of calories back in, you will probably do more harm than good. You may have to just sort of bring this in gradually. Like in this vein, I talked about amenorrhea, I talked about menstrual cycle loss, which occurs in many female athletes. And it causes a lot of long-term damage, permanent bone mineral density loss, like a lot of bad things happen because not only does the body start to shut down overall metabolic, menstrual cycle dysfunction, low estrogen, immune system function goes down, recovery goes down. And really the treatment for this type of amenorrhea, it's called functional hypothalamic amenorrhea, is to eat more and exercise less. The problem is getting crazy athletes to do it.
Right.
Because what they will do is go, okay, I'll take one more day off per week, and then they'll just exercise harder on the other days. Like at that point, you're almost looking at, you need therapy. Like at that point, you need psychological intervention. But what they find is that if they can get them to bring calories even above that critical threshold, over some time period, menstrual cycle function generally recovers. Like there's no indication that it's permanent, but it's a matter of doing it. So yes, if you do have that client that's been, what ends up happening was a number of things. Is that one, yes, we're getting this overall reduction in metabolic processes. In terms of all, you also tend to see in those women, when you're doing that much exercise and that few calories, your activity the rest of the day is generally very, very low.
Right.
It has to be. There is a weird exception. In anorexia, there's frequently an anorectic hyperactivity.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
And I don't eating disorder is not my forte, so I will probably, if I'm talking completely out of my rear end, I apologize. The thought is that it's, I don't know, it's just something about the specific neurochemistry in some anorexics, and it may simply be a way to try it. It may be fit, maybe to get them to go move around and get more food. It's hard to say, but you do see that a lot of people, they do 2 hours of exercise a day. That's great, but then they do nothing the rest of the day because they're exhausted. So I think what you see is that as you start to ease activity back, as you start to bring calories up, you almost can, you can stay in calorie balance. We've seen these reports online of women who were like, I was at whatever 1,500 calories in 2 hours a day and my weight was static, and now I'm at 2,000 calories in an hour, but I'm still at maintenance. Because you're seeing as calories come up, you can get some metabolic recovery from this depressed diet state. But even as activity comes down, if meat and everything else is ratcheting back up, you end up staying in calorie balance. And that's what you get into some weirdness. You can be in low energy availability, but you're not in a diet setting. You're still at maintenance, which is why it's different than calorie balance, because it's relative. It's just that relative to exercise. So yeah, you just have to find ways to sort of gradually ease them out of that. One of the things, just kind of a random note. Actually, no, that's totally different topic. I will stay on this one. So yes, you do, but you do have this biology too, where, because even with, I mean, think about it, shutting down immune system uses a ton of calories. When one's body does that, that's saving calories. We know, what do women often report, or men and women, when they diet really hard? Their hair and nails stop growing. Why would the body spend calories on that when it's barely surviving in the first place? By not making an endometrium, by not getting pregnant, by not producing an egg, that's saving 1,400 calories extra a month that it doesn't have. You don't see bone mineral density starts to decrease, because making bone is a highly energetic process. These are all adaptations to save calorie expenditure. So yeah, you see this weirdness as calories come out, as energy availability improves. Even if you get slightly above that threshold, some of those negative adaptations may reverse and maintenance goes up.
Is there ever a time where, obviously I know that there's no such thing as metabolic damage and then adaptations, but is there ever a time where someone could run into an issue where their metabolic rate does not ever recover if they've been doing that for so long?
Well, let me take that back. For the most part, when I've looked at like yo-yo dieting and stuff like that, I've never seen any research to support that, but I don't know if it's really, if they've examined. I think anorexics would probably be the best model to look at this. And so far, everything I've looked at, if you can get them to eat back to a healthy weight, which again is its own problem, it seems like everything recovers to normal. At least based on what, could there be individual differences? I suppose. But so far as I can tell, I've seen nothing to suggest any sort of permanent damage can occur. And trust me, if anyone's seen anything in humans that says I'm wrong, please send it to me, because I'd love to see it. But no, I don't. So the issue is just getting them to do it. That's usually the hard bit. But yeah, I don't think so. I think the only exception I've ever seen, even with yo-yo dieting, when people do stuff like this during their teenage years, like wrestlers, like male, because wrestlers do all kinds of awful things to cut weight and stuff, you'll often see like a permanent decrease in metabolic rate later in life. But that's because they did it during this place when their biology is very plastic. And this is actually relevant, I guess, in the sense that, unfortunately, a lot of when you see this type of starvation and under eating and over exercising is in adolescent females. So it is possible. And again, I don't tend to look at that data in younger folks, male or female. That is it could occur, but I think in adult, I've never seen anything to suggest there can be a permanent change or permanent decrease. And even there, most of the decrease in daily energy expenditure, as much as we focus on resting metabolic rate, most of it's in NEAT.
Right.
But resting metabolic rate just doesn't really, unless you lose a ton of body fat, it just doesn't change that much. Most of it is in the rest of your daily activity, which just crushes. It can just crater when you're dieting and doing 2 hours of hard exercise per day.
Yeah.
So it's always been fascinating to me. Actually, we'll touch on this just because I think it's interesting. We talked about the fat loss thing. So I mentioned that women's bodies tend to use more fat for fuel during aerobic activity. Now realize we don't burn a ton of fat during aerobic activity, no matter how you cut it. It's like, woohoo, 15 grams in an hour, woohoo, 1/90th of a pound of fat, or 1/30th. Yeah, 1/30th of a pound of fat, woohoo. However, since they use more fat for fuel during exercise, they burn more carbs the rest of the day. And for men, it's the opposite. Men burn more carbs during aerobic activity and then burn proportionally more fat the rest of the day. And what do we all know at this point? Overall fat loss, the other 23 hours are way more important than the hour of activity that you do. Now, if you couple this with sort of a woman's typical diet, right? In my experience is typically fairly low in protein, excessive in carbohydrates frequently. Fats can vary from either extremely low to too high, like it just depends on the population you're dealing with. And so, can you stop, please? Oh my goodness. If you can be calm, you can come in here. And so what you're seeing is that, all right, so she's doing her 2 hours of low intensity cardio, eating a high carb diet. Her muscle glycogen stores are never going down. And that's a big determinant of what we burn for energy the rest of the day. When you deplete muscle carbohydrate stores, your muscles burn more fat. If she's lifting, she's probably of the, don't go heavier than 3 pounds or you'll get bulky. There's that one famous, I can see it in y'all's faces. You're just like, see it every day. Makes me, kills me too. And nothing's happening because essentially what she's doing, she's burning a little fat during exercise and her body's just relying on carbohydrates the rest of the day. Then the story is so common. Then, and they'll do that for years to no effect. Then for whatever reason, a woman will sort of either get into the high intensity interval training mode or should get sucked into weight training more intensely for whatever reason. And usually, especially as part of the weight training subculture, that means eating more protein. That means moderating carbs. Suddenly she's doing a high intensity form of activity that can only use carbs for fuel, whether it's intervals or weight training or both. Suddenly she's depleting muscle glycogen. Suddenly she's not refilling it by eating, I've literally seen 80% carb diets. You probably have too. Maybe it's changed. Okay, so realize I'm old. I'm used to the 1990s and early 2000s. I have a feeling things are a little bit different now because all that sort of that generation of terrible information has gotten better, at least. And I think in another generation, once we've got women that have been brought up on at least better social media, et cetera, we're raised, the next generation won't be given the same terrible diet advice from the 50s that has been, the less you eat, the better, live on vegetables, all that nonsense. Anyway, so a woman does that. Suddenly, like I said, she's pushing herself in the weight room, reducing her cardio, which probably means her energy availability is better, which may mean her metabolic status is better, depleting muscle glycogen. And like women will just go like, I've seen more changes in 2 months than I saw in 2 years of that other nonsense. And at a physiological level, because of what's happening metabolically, especially within the muscle and improving her ability to use fat for fuel, she has turned herself into, so I'll say it together, a fat burning machine. But in this case, it's actually true because I do think you're seeing these systematic shifts. So I think that change, that fundamental change in women's approach to activity, becoming more involved in more intense weight training, realizing that, it won't make you bulky or make you manly or make it so you can't get a man or whatever. I worked at a place once, a woman came in and said her doctor told her that the Stairmaster would make her ovaries swell. You can't make that up. Can't make that up, folks. It's amazing. That stuff's amazing to me. And so, yeah, so that tends to be, I think a systematic change in what women are doing, but you still have the extremists, the the less I eat, the better. The more exercise, the better. And I think you may be looking at subclinical eating disorders, exercise addiction. In that vein, I just love telling this story. Are y'all familiar with the infamous 60s Barbie doll that came out? You know the one I'm talking about?
Yeah.
No.
There was a Barbie in the 60s that came with a scale and this little book that said how to lose weight. And you flipped it over and it said, don't eat.
Oh my God.
No, go Google it. I'm not.
Wow.
I'm only
Go-
familiar with it because I heard you talk about it on a different
Yeah.
podcast, and then I Googled it and I saw it.
And you go Google and you're like, that is a for real thing, because that is what you did. My mom would tell me, she's in her 70s. She's like, yep, you'd go to whatever the Woolworths where they had food counters, and you'd see women eating cottage cheese and salad and look and read. That's just how you did it. That's how you dieted at the time. And I do think, or I like to hope things have changed with the advent of some better social media. I've certainly seen changes. The number of women in the weight room, I mean, that's exploded in sports. God, when I was starting, if you saw, a couple women in the weight room, that now it's 50-50, easy. So I do think things have changed, but in a very real way, like, how do men approach fat loss? They go on Atkins and go lift weights, because that's what men love to do. Men hate cardio and men hate stretching. Mainly because we're bad at stretching. Women love to stretch, and they're already too flexible women don't need to stretch, but they love it because they're good at it. Men hate stretch. And in a very real way, women seeking to change their body composition should approach it more like what men traditionally do. And again, I'm sure this is exactly what you tell every client you've ever had. Like, all right, we need to get your protein to at least moderate amounts. It doesn't be super high. Moderate your carbs, get you pushing yourself in the weight room to some degree, maybe stop the 3 hours of aerobics per day. I used to see it. I remember watching women that would do an hour on the treadmill or the Stairmaster before going to aerobics class. All the time. Which, like I said, I'm sure that's exactly what you tell, at least in general, to most of your clients. And that's kind of, that's the combination that works.
Does the metabolism slow down as women age?
It does to a degree in all of us. It's not nearly as large as a lot of people make it out to be. What you're usually seeing is decreases in activity in both men and women. However, and this makes a good brief, another thing that separates men from women, or women from men rather, men are basically the same from start to finish. As I have said on many a podcast, we're just the same a-hole from the time we hit puberty till the end. In men, testosterone, it goes down over time, but that's it. In women, there are like these distinct parts of a woman's life. Puberty, menstruation, which will last from, 12 to 15 to 45 to 50. We're looking at 35 to 40 years, thereabouts of that. And then women face menopause, which is when their reproductive system shuts down completely. Now, this is again, it sounds like me pandering, but it's true. They've tried to be like, oh, there's an andropause. We can't let y'all have anything. And I'm like, we won't have time to go into PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome. They're now talking about a male form of PCOS. It's like, really? Can we just, really, guys? Really? Anyway, in men, testosterone levels drop, but they don't go to zero. It is not the same. In a woman goes from these hormonal fluctuations. There's something called perimenopause. It's the few years leading in, where things are sort of starting to shut down in the same way it kind of has to come back up, and hormones are varying. And then at menopause, our reproductive system shuts down. There is no progesterone. Estrogen is at like 10 or 15% of the levels that it was. It is nothing like what happens in men is nothing like this. And I find that terminology to be incorrect. But when that happens and estrogen levels go that low, a great many, if not most, of women's biology really goes south. You do see larger annual decreases in basal metabolic rate. Like, it's still not huge, but it does increase. But more than that, you see increase in body weight, loss of muscle mass, increase in body fat. There's frequently a shift from hip and thigh fat to more of a central male-like body fat pattern. There can be sexual dysfunction. There is vaginal atrophy, which can occur because estrogen is super important to function. Mental function can decline. Hot flashes. I mean, there's over like 100 possible symptoms. It's called the climacteric. It's like, I think it's a German word. And I'm just like, what an odd term for it. It's like, does it derive from climate? Is it supposed to, whatever. It gets bad. A lot of things go very, very, very wrong at menopause. And metabolic rate is one. NEAT goes down. Estrogen is involved in that, certainly. So yes, it does, but for most of it's just that activity goes down, and you do sort of, one of the things that sort of speaks to that is lately there's been a lot of research into masters athletes, both women and men. There's been this longstanding question. All right, we know that as we get old, everything just kind of goes to pot, right? We lose muscle, we lose strength, we lose power, etc. We lose bone, everything kind of goes awry. We gain fat, etc. But the question has always been, is this age related or activity related? And it's both. Masters athletes, until they get, obviously an 80-year-old athlete is not going to be their 20-year-old self, but to a great degree, a large majority of that younger function in terms of strength, muscle mass, power, body fat is maintained. So it's really, a lot of it is really changing activity. But again, when estrogen levels drop to zero, a lot of things go very, very, very bad. I did actually have one study. Weight training in menopausal women seemed to help prevent a lot of the negative effects that occurred due to menopause for whatever reason, which again just points to, like, that's honestly the key. We've known this for a while, but hopefully we are past the era of aerobic activity. Like, everyone should be doing heavy weight training, almost women more so than men, because of the bone mineral density issues, stuff again that men just don't face by and large. In that vein, I'll come back to the menopause and hormone replacement a little bit. Here's your morbid piece of trivia for today. So I learned in college, men don't generally suffer osteoporosis to the same degree as women. And there's a couple reasons for it. One, men's bone mineral density is higher than women's. It falls more slowly. But one of the main reasons is that men die on average 7 years younger than women. Men die before osteoporosis becomes a problem. So there you go. There's your morbid trivia for the day. But heavy weight training is absolutely the key way to maintain bone mineral density. They're even finding that it can increase bone mineral density later in life, which we always thought didn't occur. But it has to be sufficiently heavy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, all these factors, like I said, at menopause do really go wrong. Most of them can be reversed with hormone replacement therapy. I don't know if you want to get into that today. That's sort of its own kettle of fish. It's not nearly as complicated as birth control. But yeah, so to answer long version of your question, it does, but not to nearly degree. It's mostly activity related. And if you stay active later into life, it doesn't seem like it drops to nearly the degree I think we tend to think. People just move around less.
So I think we'll stop there for today, and then maybe if you're okay with coming on again to,
absolutely,
yeah, that'd be great. So for anyone that wants to buy your books and learn more about you, where can they find you?
So my website has been bodyrecomposition.com since forever. Like, I must have had this domain for 20 years. I've got articles on anything you care to name. My store is just at store.bodyrecomposition.com. If you want to find me, I'm most active. I've got a Facebook group, again, called Body Recomposition that I'm on daily. I always like to point out, I have a tendency to attract just incredible experts in all kinds of areas. Like I'm blown away daily. Like people will ask a question about the most weird, some disease or condition I've never even heard of. And we'll have 3 people that have had it, 3 people that have recovered from it, and at least 1 medical critical care expert that treats it. It's mind-boggling to me. Unfortunately, the OBGYN we had has a new child, and chose to get off Facebook for reasons related to last year. Probably a good choice. But yeah, and I've got an Instagram, but it's mainly bad jokes, so don't worry about that. So yeah, my website, my store, really my Facebook group.
I would definitely say that that Facebook group is so valuable, and I've met a lot of different experts on there that have really helped me. So.
It like I said, it blows my mind daily in threads that I'm simply not. We've got like 5 top-notch physios, 2 of whom are doctors. Just like I said, it's mind-blowing to me. And any question you have will probably get an expert answer, which is rare. So
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We look forward to the next one.